Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I have the honor of doing this interview with Professor Johanna Oksala. Johanna Oksala is the Arthur J. Schmitt Professor of Philosophy at Loyola University, Chicago. Before joining LUC, she taught at Pratt Institute of Art and Design, the New School of Social Research, University of Helsinki, and University of Dundee. Professor Oksala's areas of expertise and interests include political philosophy, feminist philosophy, environmental philosophy, Foucault, and phenomenology. Some of her works to mention include Feminism, Capitalism, and Ecology, the most recent book, I believe, published by Northwestern University Press. Before that, Feminist Experiences, drawing on both Foucault and phenomenology, Foucault, Politics and Violence, Foucault and Freedom, and for general readers and general audiences, she has also written two books. One is called Political Philosophy, All That Matters, and another one, How to Read Foucault. So first of all, thank you so much, Professor Oksala, for joining me.
Thank you, Davood. It's a pleasure to be here.
So shall we begin with a general question? How would you characterize your work, your approach within the wider context of scholarship, perhaps with reference to some of your main preoccupations and interests?
I'm a philosopher. I think I like to start with that. And within that field, my work falls within social and political philosophy. And then I'm interested in various topics and approaches within that field. As you mentioned, feminist philosophy, phenomenology, environmental philosophy, more and more Marxist theory. And I published a lot on Foucault, and I think we're going to talk about him today.
Looking at the themes of your published work, there is a lot of continuity, but I was wondering if you could also speak a little bit about maybe some turning points, if there have been major turning points in your thinking, the changes in topics or in priorities, and in how you approach issues and questions.
Yes, there's certainly been changes and turns, and I think that's good. I think philosophers should try and find new directions. They should challenge themselves, and that I try to do. I started systematically reading Marx about 10 years ago. That was kind of a turn for me. When I was a student in the 1990s, we didn't read Marx. The verdict at the time seemed to be that he was outdated, not just politically, but theoretically. And now, of course, the situation has completely changed. At least since the financial crisis of 2008, he's definitely back in fashion. I started reading him in the context of my work on feminist critiques of neoliberalism. And after the publication of my book, Feminist Experiences, which dealt with feminist critiques of neoliberalism, I felt that I'd kind of reached an impasse and that I needed new theoretical tools, not just for understanding neoliberalism, but understanding capitalism. And that sort of forced me or led me to reading Marx. And I'm still in some ways doing that. I think my growing interest in environmental political philosophy is also a shift, at least in topics. I've been concerned about environmental problems really my whole adult life, or even as a teenager. But it's only in the last few years that I felt that I could tackle these problems philosophically. And sometimes I just want to read something completely different without any particular project or problem in mind. Many so-called continental philosophers, which I'm one of those, I think, never really read analytic philosophy and vice versa. But I try to sometimes cross that border because I think it's important. So last summer, for example, I read Robert Brandam's magnum opus, Making It Explicit, and I found it very interesting. I didn't think I would use it for any of my own projects, but I actually ended up using some of his ideas in a recent article I've been working. So yes, certainly shifts and changes.
I was curious, what do you mean, or what does it mean to read a thinker systematically? You you said going to Marx and reading him systematically.
Well, I think it means that you don't just take some ideas, but that you start a difficult book like Capital can be, and you read it from cover to cover.
Hmm.
And then you read the second volume of Capital, and then you read the third volume of Capital, because I think there's a lot of pressure in terms of time, and we need to be productive, and we try to just quickly absorb ideas, and that means taking shortcuts, and 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 we inevitably lose a lot of the context.
Hmm. Thank you. Yep. I listened in preparation for this interview. I listened to an interview that you did with the New Books Network about uh, this book, Feminism, Capitalism, and Ecology. And very interestingly, in that interview, you mentioned that as an undergraduate student, you were not always the most engaged, most interested, sometimes falling asleep in the back row. And because this is the important part, because the material was, you felt, as many students feel, disconnected from real world issues and from what we find in our personal lives. And I was wondering if this is itself a skill, detecting the disconnect between theory and material, academic scholarly material, and real life issues. Is that sensitivity to the disconnection, this disparity and disconnection, something that scholars vary in that? And is that something that we can learn to be sensitive to? And how you approach this in your own teaching when you interact with students?
I think it's an interesting idea that it's a skill, um, because I would certainly like to think that it's something like that. I certainly wasn't a very good student always, but I have to say that the way we teach philosophy these days has also changed a lot. I think these days professors can't just stand in front of the room and talk nonstop for an hour and a half. We have to show video clips and do group activities and little quizzes and so on. So I think it's much harder for students to catch up on their sleep. And I think everybody, all philosophy professors these days are explicitly told that they need to try and make connections between some of this abstract material and connected to real life issues and students' experiences and so on. And I think that's important. I certainly try to do that, try to show that philosophy can give you critical tools that you can apply to understand your own life and the world that you live in. But I think we also have a kind of an opposite challenge in classrooms, which is to try and make the students see that philosophical inquiry can be interesting and important, even if it's not solving any concrete problems, even if it can't directly be applied to anything. Because I think also our culture emphasizes a lot of this kind of problem solving approach to knowledge. And in that respect, philosophy has a pretty bad track record. We've been essentially pondering the same questions for a couple of thousand years, and not made much progress. What's the meaning of life? What is justice? What is consciousness? I don't see us solving any of those problems anytime soon, but that doesn't mean that it isn't important to pose those questions and try to reflect on them rationally, critically, thoughtfully.
Mhm. I heard this term, interesting term, philosophophobia, which is like the phobia of philosophy. And in everyday discourse, I routinely run into these moments when somebody says, "Oh, I don't want to get too philosophical here," or that might be too philosophical, as an indication that we shouldn't go there. Or Is that a challenge in your teaching experiences to get over philosophophobia?
I haven't actually heard that expression, philosophobia. That's a new one for me. Um, but I totally recognize what you're talking about. Um, there is a kind of a prejudice against philosophy in a lot of people's mind, and that's obviously something we need to try and get over.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, let's turn to Foucault. I believe your master's thesis focused on Michel Foucault and feminism. And going back to that earlier question about turning points and changes in your scholarly career, has your thinking about Foucault changed or has gone through phases? In your really wonderful book, very useful, very helpful, How to Read Foucault, you emphasize Foucault's work as offering a set of resources for creative engagement, like a toolbox, metaphorically. And I wonder if your own use of this set of resources has shifted or changed your relationship with Foucault's work. Have there been maybe different emphases on his body of work? Maybe some works becoming more or less important over time.
Yes, definitely. I not only did I write my MA thesis on Foucault, then I wrote my PhD dissertation on Foucault, and at that point, I was very interested in Foucault's relationship to phenomenology. So there was a lot of focus initially on his early works, particularly the book The Order of Things. Then I mentioned my work when I was working on feminist critiques of neoliberalism. I was almost exclusively focusing on Foucault's lectures on governmentality, his genealogy of neoliberalism, which dates to the late 1970s. Recently, I've been interested in critiques of capitalism, so now I've been looking at Foucault's work from the early 70s, where he engages most directly with Marx and Althusser and other Marxist thinkers of his time. So I think there are also kind of shifts in his work that different books lend themselves or different texts lend themselves to different problems and questions. But I think there's also a change in that I think I'm a better reader of Foucault now. I because sometimes I might be doing prep for teaching and I'm reading some text that I think I know pretty well, and yet I find something completely new in it. And that to me is interesting. I'd like to think that it's not because I'm a particularly bad reader or a bad philosopher, but because Foucault is a really great philosopher. So his texts are really packed with ideas, and one can read him again and again and still find something new in the text.
For students who are relatively unfamiliar with Foucault, uh, how would you tell them about the relevance of his work today? Like why they should engage with him, why we should read him and reread him?
I think I think Foucault is important for a number of reasons. I think what makes his approach accessible or kind of easy to apply um, is the fact that he's not a system builder. You mentioned the metaphor of a toolbox. He himself characterized his work as a toolbox that readers could rummage through and find different tools that they might use. So we don't have to buy into the whole system. We can just use the tools that we need. And his work really the domain of his studies is almost always social practices. His whole oeuvre can be mapped out as studies of different social practices. And I think this means that we can kind of cut through a lot of metaphysical difficulties because we're actually focusing on concrete practices ultimately. And that means also that politically we can we can political change becomes easier to imagine when we're dealing with social practices rather than some lofty metaphysical abstract ideas, because social practices can be changed. That's what we think politics is about. It's about changing practices. So political change becomes much easier to imagine and much easier to concretely bring about. I guess I would also emphasize his methodological innovations. So Foucault's studies are almost always histories. They are histories of some phenomenon that typically we are used to taking, that typically we take for granted. We wouldn't problematize, such as the prison. We think that there's always been prisons. This is, of course, how we deal with crime. What else would we do? And Foucault's histories show how this is actually a fairly recent phenomenon, fairly recent way of dealing with what we think of as criminals, a specific practice of punishing that has a fairly recent origin. And that, of course, then can make the reader suddenly see their own culture and society as kind of strange. There's ideally this moment of estrangement where things that we have taken for granted suddenly aren't anymore. And I think a lot of philosophers, not just Foucault, but a number of philosophers would characterize philosophy along these lines, that it's trying to question things that we take to be self-evident. It's trying to problematize things that we didn't think were even there, trying to bring things visible and make them objects of our critical reflection. But I think Foucault has come up with a pretty effective method for doing that through his what he calls his genealogy, histories of the present.
Thank you. And now I hesitate a little bit to ask you my next question. I want to ask you about misunderstandings of Foucault,
Mm-hmm.
the popular culture, to the extent that you follow these relatively popular speakers or commentators. The reason why is because, like, somebody might think, why should we even engage with those misunderstandings? But sometimes these misunderstandings or misrepresentations just really become like blocks on our way of really getting to a thinker and genuinely understanding them. Instead, those misrepresentations become more attractive for our attention, and they replace the thinker and their work itself. So, for that reason, I'd like to ask you about what are some of the important misunderstandings of Foucault that you have noticed?
Yes, there are a lot of misunderstandings and also controversies circulating around his thought. And I just try to think that this is also a testimony to his influence, and maybe to the fact that his ideas are to some extent neo-radical, or at least were at the time when he wrote. And I don't, I try not to spend too much time on trying to correct all misunderstandings, because I don't think that's my job really. I think Foucault can do that himself, and I think people who engage with his work will, come to see why they are misunderstandings. But I'm happy to list a few just to give our listeners maybe a sense of what we're talking about. Okay, what I take to be common misunderstandings: the idea that Foucault was sympathetic or even advocated neoliberalism, the idea that he denied that there are any truths, the idea that he abolished completely the subject and instead gave power agency, the idea that his late thought was a kind of an individualistic retreat to some kind of apolitical self-fashioning. And then there are, of course, the sensational aspects of his private life that many people have, that have caused controversy, and that some commentators have really focused on them because they've seen these aspects of his personal life as a key to understanding his theoretical ideas. So he was a homosexual, he died of AIDS, he spent a while in a mental institution when he was young, he experimented with drugs and so on. And of course, it's not like all this is insignificant. I don't think we can completely separate a thinker's life from their theoretical ideas. But also, I think it's kind of reductive to try and bring them together too tightly.
I think maybe interestingly, the first volume of the history of sexuality is relevant to that in responding to those dismissive ways of thinking about him, like that preoccupation and curiosity about people's sexuality and that way of bringing them into discourse. Uh, so
Sure.
in addition to Foucault, as someone who's interesting in his own right, do you find that Foucault would be a helpful companion in approaching other thinkers, movements, disciplines, schools of thoughts? Is there an advantage in approaching a field like, let's say, phenomenology or psychoanalysis or psychology, a field through a Foucauldian lens?
Um, yeah, maybe. I mean, as we talked about his toolbox, it kind of lends itself to this type of work. But of course, it's always tricky to bring frameworks together, especially frameworks that are fairly comprehensive, such as psychoanalysis or phenomenology. I think Foucault has been most useful and could be most useful for forms of critical theory, such as feminist theory, queer theory, critical race philosophy, because his conception of power, I think, is very useful for that kind of critical work. And particularly his sort of critical concern that identity categories themselves are constructed in networks of power. So, so that has meant that these kinds of theoretical platforms or political movements that simply take identity as an unquestioned starting point need to refigure what they mean when they're fighting for women's emancipation, for example. Because of course the category of women, according to Foucauldian thinking, is actually a category that's been constructed in oppressive patriarchal societies. And of course, that category itself can be problematic. Feminism can't just fight for women, whoever the women are, but should more fundamentally question the binary gender that we operate with. So I think that has been uh, a tremendous influence that Foucault has had, for example, for studies of feminist theory, gender theory, studies of sexuality.
Mhm, mhm. Now, shifting topics a little bit, yeah, you have written about the politics of the body, especially in relation to labor. In your book, Feminism, Capitalism, and Ecology, you discuss the topic of surrogate motherhood as an example of how capitalism commodifies and rents out our bodies. And I find this striking in two senses, not only in its literal terms, of course, it's literally something that is happening in the so-called service industry, but it's also, I think, a metaphor that sheds light on labor more generally, for how workers feel alienated from their quote unquote offsprings, their future. And I was wondering if you would agree or if you think it's useful or too much of a stretch to apply the metaphor of a surrogacy to other forms of labor.
Um, I think for sure within limits. But in the chapter on surrogacy in that book, I actually also try to argue that we need to preserve the ability to focus on the aspects of surrogacy that make it unlike any other job. So my starting point in that chapter was the extensive Marxist feminist literature that basically insists that gestational surrogates should be understood as laborers. They are care workers, essentially. And according to these views, the failure to recognize that this is labor, has then resulted in inadequate compensation for this work and also hidden forms of labor exploitation that are specific to this line of work. And while I initially found this argument very compelling, I then came to see that it omitted something important concerning the embodied, lived experience of pregnancy. Because I think we can understand the process of gestating a child as analogous to labor only by ignoring some important aspects of the embodied experience. Both the womb, that in these Marxist feminist accounts is supposed to be the means of production, and the fetus that is the product of that labor, can of course can only be detached or externalized as abstractions. During pregnancy, these parts cannot be in any way detached. They are just part of a pregnant body. And after the birth, the baby can obviously be physically detached, but arguably only with at least some psychological cost to the surrogate. So in that chapter, I'm trying to show that surrogacy contracts are therefore ultimately different from all other labor contracts because the worker cannot be separated from the contracted product, the baby, for at least 9 months. And my concern is that these theoretical accounts, whether they're medical accounts or Marxist feminist accounts, that view the fetus and the uterus of the surrogate as technically and legally isolatable components of a production process, they partake in a particular understanding of surrogacy in which pregnancy is detached from the embodied experience of the surrogate. And in that chapter, I suggest that instead of insisting that surrogates are laborers, we should recognize and take seriously the new forms of kinship that surrogacy as an embodied experience in fact creates. And this kind of recognition would then result in very different kinds of political demands than the traditional socialist demands for fairer compensation and more extensive labor rights, for example. One such demand could be that surrogates should be given more concrete power to define their role in these new forms of kinship created by gestational surrogacy, something they don't have at the moment. For example, we could advocate for the right of surrogates to arrange an open surrogacy, open adoption, if they wanted to, in order to secure a future connection to the child and the commissioning family. Because currently, a lot of in the case of transnational commercial gestational surrogacy, which is what I was looking at, the commissioning couple is often somewhere in a country in the global north, while the surrogates are far away, thousands of miles away, typically in a country in the global south. And once the commissioning couple leaves with the baby, all ties are completely severed. And this can be, according to ethnographical studies at least, this can be quite hard for the surrogates. They often assume that they are going to keep in touch with the baby.
Thank you. Thanks for that clarification. Your response actually clarifies another question, which is like about the difference between other forms of labor and this form of labor, gestational surrogate motherhood, which is is it a quantitative difference or a qualitative difference? And you demonstrated that it's a qualitative difference and it merits treating it that way. Um, in the same book, you also argue that about approaching topics like this, you argue that environmentalism and feminism must join forces to confront capitalism. Um, and similarly, in the earlier book, Feminist Experiences, you point out that the separation between metaphysics and political feminism um, shouldn't be the how we approach social criticism, and political feminists should be interested in metaphysics. This raises the question about these separations.
Mhm.
Why do these movements or disciplines or lines of thought become separate? Is it an issue of, as you said earlier, the urge towards productivity and efficiency, specialization, narrowing of focus over time, or are there tensions between these disciplines and lines of thought?
I mean, there can certainly be genuine tensions, but sometimes those tensions can also be productive. I'm actually working on another introductory book at the moment titled "What is Ecofeminism?" with a colleague, Sanna Karhu. And ecofeminism was, of course, precisely an attempt to connect feminist and environmental concerns, both theoretically and politically. It developed in the 1970s when these emerging large-scale environmental movements intersected with social justice movements such as feminism. And ecofeminists did pioneering studies, groundbreaking work really in the 70s and 80s, showing how oppressions of women and nature intersected in various ways. But then in the 1990s, there was a definite backlash or turn, or something happened. Ecofeminism began to be criticized very heavily for essentialism, anti-intellectualism. Ecofeminists were viewed as somehow as these crazy goddess worshippers who essentialize oppressive ideas about femininity and so on. And so instead of ecofeminism then sort of developing as an important strand of feminist theory that would have compensated its anthropocentric features, it became very quickly marginalized. And I think this was a mistake. I think there were certainly problems with some of the early ecofeminist accounts, and I think we need to try and, in some ways, update what we mean by ecofeminism. Um, Also, simply because feminist theory has changed a lot since the 70s and 80s. We are intersectional feminists now. We have a non-binary account of gender. Women's role in the labor market has changed, and so on. So I think certainly we need to do some updating, but I think it's also important to try and recuperate some sense of ecofeminism because I think we need it now. We need forms of ecofeminism today that can confront capitalism and the problems it produces, both for environmental sustainability and gender equality. And yes, I think similarly, there's often a strange disconnect between metaphysical inquiry and politics or political theory. People think that metaphysics is some kind of apolitical armchair activity. And I think that's definitely not true. I think metaphysics importantly lays the ground, the possibilities for what kinds of political options become even viable. If we think of the time when all Europeans believed that kings ruled because of God-given divine right, it was obviously very difficult in that situation to push for any kind of democratic political demands. Our metaphysics, our worldview had to shift in ways that it had to become much more secular, much more materialist, scientific, for that kind of political demands to become viable and even intelligible. So I think that the connection between metaphysics and politics is definitely there, and it's important to acknowledge.
I think it was in your book on violence, politics, Foucault. I'm maybe reordering, misremembering the order of words in the title. But you have this really unforgettable line about how ontology is a politics that has forgotten itself. It's
Right.
self-forgetfulness of the being of politics.
And of course, that line, in a sense, emphasizes the opposite movement. So not just that we need our metaphysics to change for certain political possibilities to open up, but that certain kinds of political practices, in fact, uphold a certain kind of metaphysics. And those need to change for it to become possible for us to see also the world in new ways. So I think the two must go together. And yes, in that sense, ontology is politics that has forgotten itself, because the two are co-constitutive in some ways, in fundamental ways.
Mhm, mhm. Maybe somewhat related. I was wondering if you could unpack what you mean by this idealized image of nature, which I run into even not just in scholarly works, but also in works of fiction. This idealized image of nature, idealized image of woman, idealized image of indigenous people, and they're somehow they all merge into one. It all goes back to nature and being natural and pure, and what it does and its problems in thinking through these issues.
Again, I think we need to go back to metaphysics in some ways, because these kinds of views of environmental politics, where environmental politics is about protecting a wild nature somewhere out there, these kinds of views are really rooted in fundamental metaphysical distinctions that organize our thought and organize reality. Um, Namely nature culture. That's a really fundamental dualism that organizes the way we make sense of the world. Human, non-human, that's another variant of that dichotomy in some ways, or socio-political versus nature. And I think these boundaries are actually much more complicated and contested than we like to think. So on the one hand, our conception of nature and the 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 real thing, the nature, the thing that we refer to by this concept of nature, is of course much more culturally constructed than we like to think. Our exactly our conceptions of what is natural, what is nature, is in some way specific to us, to a certain kind of Western metaphysical view. I mean, apparently there are cultures that don't have the concept of nature at all, because it's not that there is something that's other than what they are, but we have this idea of nature as something that's not us. And that, of course, has problematic consequences in all kinds of ways, in the sense that we, instead of questioning these boundaries, we take them for granted in some ways. And what the questioning of them would be that we might have to also question what is excluded and what is included, and the political consequences of that. So again, to give an example from our history of philosophy, or legal theory, all these debates about whether women or racialized people have souls, or whether they are more like animals who have no soul. This was, of course, no pure metaphysical debate, but had concrete consequences in how the people, the groups falling outside of the realm of the human were treated and what kinds of legal rights they could have. So it's important, I think, to question these boundaries, question what we understand by nature, and how we could try and draw these boundaries differently. What would that mean? Especially now when we are really confronted with enormous environmental problems. I think we need, of course, practical solutions quickly, but we also need fundamental questions about our worldview, our metaphysics, of how we understand our relationship to nature, uh, to non-human animals, and so on.
Mhm. Asking about your writing, because you have both writing intended for specialists, audiences, and for generalist readers, I want to ask you about whether you approach those writing projects differently, like political philosophy, all that matters, how to read Foucault. Is that a different kind of experience for you? And is that a challenge? How do you approach those types of writing?
Yes, I mean, there's certainly different uh, kinds of projects, but I I think that the main difference is not accessibility, because I think some people think that, when you write academic books, they are difficult, and then when you write for general readers, you try and make ideas easy and clear and accessible. Um, but I think I try to do that in my academic books too. No matter what I write, I try to make ideas clear, accessible, arguments coherent, and so on. I would put the the key difference in this way. When I write books for general audiences, I try to some extent mute my own voice or my own position. So I'm not trying to build up my own original position. The aim is more to give an overview of the field, key topics, key problems, and so on. But of course, my voice is there just in that choice of what I take to be key topics, what I include, what I exclude, how I introduce the field or the topic or the thinker. But I try to think that my original contribution is on that level, not on the level of defending specific arguments. And that, of course, is a different kind of challenge, because
Wow.
I of course have strong views about, writing about political philosophy. I have strong political views myself, but I try not to make them too obvious.
Mm. That's a great distinction that real representation or the extent to which you let the text be influenced by your own positions.
Mhm.
That varies depending on the audience. That's great. I would say I completely uh, agree with you. Your uh, specialist writing is very accessible.
Mhm.
I was reading about early on in the book. You talk about the functionalist critique, and you don't assume that the reader knows about that, and you sort of provided a brief definition of it for the purpose of the discussion. And likewise, throughout, I don't feel like I need to go elsewhere to get the prerequisite, and that's really great.
Thank you.
Uh,
Yeah,
for,
that's certainly what I try to do.
for our viewers, readers who are new to your work, do you have suggestions as to where to begin, most representative of your positions, your arguments? Do you have ideas about what would be a good entry point into your approach and concerns, or do you think it's an idiosyncratic choice by readers? They have to decide on their own.
I'd like to think that this interview will be a great entry point for people who might be interested in my work. Um, and yeah, obviously for readers who might not be professional philosophers or academics, I suggest you start with the books that are intended for general audiences, How to Read Foucault, Political Philosophy, All That Matters. But I think, as you said, I think the academic books are fairly accessible too. At least this most recent one, Feminism, Capitalism, and Ecology, or Capitalism, Feminism, and Ecology. Uh,
Feminism first.
Even I can't remember the title now. Um, I think it deals with issues that really should interest everybody.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I would agree. Um, my own favorite, I mean, if I were to recommend, I would also recommend Violence, Politics, and Foucault. It was I
I
found
think those are in a different order. Foucault, politics, and violence.
right. Thank you. Thanks for correcting. I will have while editing the interview, I will have the book cover on display, so it
Great.
clarifies that. Well, Professor Oksala, those were my questions. Was there something I failed to ask that you'd like to mention before we conclude?
No, I think this is a great conversation. I hope your viewers enjoyed too. I just want to thank you for this opportunity to
Thank you.
talk about my work and share ideas.
Thank you so
Uh,
much. Maybe briefly, you could share with us your forthcoming work. You mentioned already one of your projects, but anything else that we can look forward to?
I am I'm working, as I said, on an introductory book for Polity Press called "What is Eco-Feminism?" with a colleague Sanna Karhu, and we are hoping to give a contemporary introduction to ecofeminism.
Mhm.
I'm also working on a article on climate change for a special issue of the Canadian Journal of Philosophy. That might be interesting for some people. And I'm I have some projects on both Foucault and Marxist theory also. So we'll see whether they end up becoming a book or just a bunch of articles.
Great, great. Once again, Professor Oksala, thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully we will talk again in the future.
Thank you, Davood. My pleasure.